What makes a bad album? For me, it's the product of a few things, but mainly, did it kill the artist's career? Is it bad in the production process? And the very important one is it just bad songs? You get many answers for what is the worst album. The three off the top of my head are Angelic to the Core by Corey Feldman, a childhood actor making the weirdest techno album ever made with features from Snoop Dogg and Fred Durst. And it's the biggest so bad it's good record I've ever heard. Or is it Summer in Paradise for being literally the exact opposite? Being one of the biggest cash grabs and killing the Beach Boys for an entire generation. This is the Beach Boys and not the classic 60s pop. Or is it Cut the Crap by The Clash, widely regarded as the worst punk album of all time, killing UK punk rock until arguably today where it's seeing a slight resurgence under UK rap. Sure, the three I mentioned killed careers, but what about an album that is received as badly today as it was around 40 years ago when it was released? Yet, it didn't kill a career. It enhanced it. It created more lore and made a whole new generation of fans saying this album is as influential to a genre as Black Sabbath to metal. An album critics considered career suicide, but today is looked as one of the best works of this artist. We look at one of these albums today. This is getting into it. The year is 1972, and overall, this might be considered one of the greatest years for music overall. Because looking back on it, the amount of classics and defining albums from this year is kind of shocking. I mean, going down the list, we've got Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street. We've got Nick Drake's Pink Moon, Machine Head by Deep Purple, No releasing their first album, and of course, David Bowie's Ziggy Stardust. They're all great albums. In fact, I'd probably say David Bowie's album is a 10 out of 10. But when critics look back on this year, there's only one album they truly consider as the best album of the year, and that is Lou Reed's Transformer. But this needs a closer look on the man himself. Louis Allen Reed was born in Brooklyn, New York, and as a child he suffered from panic attacks, which turned him to what in his eyes was his real god in rock and roll music. He played in a few bands and even hosted a radio show before meeting two people, Sterling Morrison and John Cale, and forming the Velvet Underground. The Velvet Underground are often considered the first true art rock band due to their really experimental sound and their willingness to tackle any topic in their music, and everyone loved it. To all of their songs about drug abuse, sexuality, and sex work, these first few albums are seriously considered some of the best art rock albums for being the first art rock albums. They were dismissed infamously by critics as porn rock, and after Reed left the band in 1970, he made a Velvet Underground covers album, but in 1972, he teamed up with Mick Ronson and David Bowie as co-producers and released Transformer in 1972. The themes on this album are very similar to the ones on the Velvet Underground albums. Those takes a much more personal turn, with Reed going in pretty graphic detail, and yeah, this is one of my favorite albums of the 70s. If you haven't listened to it, please go ahead and listen to it. The partnership between Reed and Bowie was really interesting, but it didn't last long as it infamously ended with David Bowie telling Lou Reed to clean his act up after a bar fight. Lou Reed toured with a bar band and then recruited a completely new band to release Berlin in 1973. It is here I bring up a very interesting quirk when talking about Lou Reed, in the fact that the critics hated all of his albums on release. I mean, you said at the start, yeah, they really dismissed the Velvet Underground. They really did not like them. And these first few solo albums from Lou Reed, they did not like these either. But over time, these albums have been received as some of the best, most ahead of time albums ever made, and mainly due to the lyricism and the lyrics and the themes Lou Reed addresses. All except one, but we'll get to that one in due time. Let's get back to Berlin. It was a concept album with, again, very similar themes. It's talking about domestic violence, suicide, addiction, and adultery in a concept album through a couple of speed freaks. It's one of the weirdest, darkest albums I've heard, and Lou Reed does brilliant work on here. I won't say it's as good as Transformer, but you need to check it out if you want to really get into Lou Reed's music. He later released his commercial peak with Sally Can't Dance in 1974, which peaked at number 10 on the Billboard charts. And this upset him. He felt disconnected with his music while he was making it, and the reception by fans and how popular it was getting, he hated it. He hated being in the public eye, and this led to some really dark turns for his career. It's here I need to stop the video before moving on, because I need to tell you guys that these were not good times for Lou Reed. He was battling a massive drug addiction at the time, and whatever comments I make are all about the music and not critiquing or minimizing the struggles the guy had to go through during these times. Anyway, let's move back to the video. Lou Reed's contract with RCA, the label he was signed to at the time, meant that they would publish whatever demo he submitted. This was a way so that he could really experience and express his creative freedom. It's a totally understandable clause. So Lou Reed handed in a demo that he proved would never be a hit. That was the last thing he wanted. He was willing to kill his career if it meant he never made a commercial album again. And in 1975, Metal Machine Music was released through RCA Records. And let's just get into this, cause oh boy, is this an album. How do I explain Metal Machine Music by conveying basically the entire album? Oh, I know, I have an idea. Let me play the first few seconds, right? The first few seconds of an album perfectly set the vibe for the album. That's at least what I think. So, here are the seconds. Let's go. Let's go. I'm so excited. Let's see what these first few seconds have to offer. What in the world is that? Okay, if at least what I can decode, that sounds like guitar feedback with a lot of effects on it. And it's like mixed in a weird way. And I would be right actually, because if you look at the recording process, that is exactly what was done. It is guitar frequencies mixed at varying speeds by Lou Reed. And now is when I answer why it's called Metal Machine Music. This is because Lou Reed claimed that with the crude and profanity-laden lyrics of Velvet Underground, he created metal, and with this album, he vowed to destroy it. With its harsh sound walls, absolutely massive soundscapes, this would be a 4-part sweep to end metal. Because Metal Machine Music is one 64-minute music piece split into 4 parts. And that intro clip you just heard, that's the album. It's 64 minutes of just that. No song, structure, melody, rhythm, nothing. It was inspired by his friend John Cale. You may remember him with the Velvet Underground. John Cale is known for being one of the most polarizing music producers of all time. In fact, one of his most famous pieces is being played right at this moment, up until 2168. Yeah, he's a madman, and that immediately contributes to the sound of this album. And what do you think the critics did with it? They did what they usually do with a Lou Reed album: tear it to apart. But this was way more harsh. It was called Career Suicide, the worst album ever made. And some, even to this day, on YouTube, you can find reviews of this album being called the worst thing in existence. Lou Reed lost his entire credibility in the music industry to this album. And that's why I was so excited to listen to it in the first place, to cover it for this essay. So, what are my thoughts on this album?
What do you want me to say? This album is awful.
Yeah, it is easily the hardest listen I've had with any album. Anytime an album makes you physically hurt, you know the album's bad. By the end of this, I started to get a headache and my ears started to ring due to all of the high-pitched sounds and frequencies laden throughout this entire album, and you don't have anything to grasp to. That's the major thing, right? Since there's no song, no melody, no rhythm of any form. The closest thing I can compare this to is doom metal music. But even in that, there is something. You have something to grip onto, some sort of note is there. But in this album, there's absolutely nothing for you to hold on to. But you know what was most surprising to me? This album has some genuine positives. There are some times where the sounds and the cacophony can sound beautiful, serene, and almost gorgeous in ways. It's in this really weird sort of the way I'm God by Clams Casino I consider as beautiful. It is quite creepy, but it's that sort of, you can look at it and it's a very beautiful scenery. And at points, this album is terrifying, like an indie horror movie soundtrack. But you know, one of those really, really good ones. It's brilliant at points. This album is 64 minutes of awful, and yet I can see the influence. Let's move on to that influence, because that is what truly got me to making this video today. Now, obviously, Lou Reed did not make this music for his entire career. If he did, he would literally not make a single dollar. In fact, his next album is Coney Island Baby, widely regarded as one of the most romantic albums ever made. But this album made way for Lou Reed's bigger experiments. Particularly, you can hear a lot of this album's ideas on Lulu, which is really weird because I seem to be the only person who liked it on their first listen. You can hear the building blocks of genres to like industrial music and noise rock throughout this entire album, and as a fan of both of those scenes, it is eye-opening to see something this avant-garde in 1975, when bands like Godspeed Black Emperor were emerging in the 90s and 2000s with this exact same sound. You go back to the sound and it's like, oh god, this sounds like that, people, in the 90s and 2000s. And I have to read some Radio Music reviews for this album. They're the ultimate music snobs, right? So they'll obviously know a bit more than me. And I'd particularly like to read this one. A review on March 21st, 2008 by a guy called Jay Shopper. And he sums up my views of this album so well. A few obvious but necessary statements to begin. Lou Reed is perhaps the ultimate personification of rock and roll. Lou Reed is a monumental asshole. Metal Machine music is unlistenable noise, but not as some have suggested, unendurable noise. I love Metal Machine music. You know, that sums up the views that I've had. This album is unendurable at points. Not completely, as Jay Shopper pointed out, but it is unlistenable. But at points, you start realizing it'll never be matched. It's unmatched in its uniqueness and its willingness to think outside the box. My ears started to hurt while this album played. I should be hating this album more than anything, yet I can love the fact that Lou Reed went into this album not wanting to make another Transformer, but trying to make the first Metal Machine music. And it is one of the most polarizing albums ever made. But in my opinion, if you want to get into music, you need at least one listen of this album. This album I will never listen to again. I don't think I'll be even crazy enough to even think about this album again. But it is an album I will always admire from afar and remember my experiences with the worst album of all time.